Blood runs through the streets of Constantinople. 30,000 bodies lie scattered across the hippodrome, their screams silenced forever. The woman who ordered this massacre, a former circus performer who once sold her body to survive. Her name was Theodora, and she would become the most powerful woman the Byzantine Empire had ever seen. Picture Constantinople in the year 500 CE, the greatest city on earth, where marble palaces touch the clouds and golden domes reflect the Mediterranean sun. But beneath this glittering surface lurks a world of unimaginable darkness. In the shadow of the great hippodrome, where 100,000 spectators roar for blood and entertainment, lies a maze of brothels, taverns, and circus quarters. Here, human flesh is currency, and children are commodities. This is where our story begins. Theodora enters this world not by choice, but by tragedy. Her father, Acacius, was a bearkeeper for the Green faction at the Hippodrome. When wild beasts needed feeding, when crowds demanded spectacle, Acacius was there. But when death claimed him, it left behind 3 young daughters and the widow, with no protection in a city that devoured the vulnerable. Theodora's mother, desperate and destitute, made a decision that would haunt her forever. She dressed her 3 daughters in their finest clothes and led them into the arena during intermission. Falling to her knees before the jeering crowd, she begged the Green faction to give her dead husband's job to her eldest daughter's new husband. The Greens laughed. They turned away. But the Blues, their eternal rivals, saw opportunity in this public humiliation. They took in the family, but their charity came with a price that would scar young Theodora's soul forever. By age 10, Theodora was working as a child actress in the most depraved theatrical performances Constantinople had ever witnessed. But these weren't mere plays. They were pornographic spectacles designed to satisfy the twisted appetites of the Byzantine elite. Imagine a child forced to perform acts no human should endure, while thousands of spectators cheered and threw coins. This was Theodora's daily reality. She learned to read the crowd's mood, to survive their cruel games, to smile while her innocence was systematically destroyed. As she grew older, the performances became more extreme. Historical accounts speak of shows so shocking that even jaded Byzantine audiences were stunned into silence. Theodora became the star of these degrading spectacles, her body a canvas for the empire's darkest fantasies. But something extraordinary was happening behind those haunted eyes. While others saw a broken girl, Zephyros was studying her tormentors. She memorized their faces, their weaknesses, their secrets. Every humiliation became a lesson in human nature. Every degradation taught her about power and its abuse. The circus had intended to break her. Instead, it forged her into something unprecedented, a woman who understood the machinery of power because she had been crushed beneath its wheels. At 18, Theodora made a desperate gamble for freedom. She had caught the eye of Hesibulus, a Syrian official appointed as governor of Pentapolis in North Africa. To him, she was an exotic prize, a famous actress to display his wealth and status. To her, he was an escape route from the hell of Constantinople. But Hesibulus's true nature revealed itself once they reached Cyrenaica. Far from the empire's watchful eyes, he treated Theodora as his personal slave. When she resisted his increasingly violent demands, he abandoned her in the African desert, a death sentence disguised as dismissal. Here, in the scorching wasteland between civilization and oblivion, Theodora faced her darkest hour. With no money, no connections, and no hope of return, she should have perished. In Alexandria, she encountered the Monophysite Christians, a persecuted sect that preached radical equality. For the first time in her life, Theodora heard that her suffering had meaning, that the powerful would be brought low, and that the last would be first. These weren't just comforting words, they were a battle cry. She learned to read and write. She studied theology and philosophy. Most importantly, she began to see her traumatic past not as shame to be hidden, but as knowledge to be weaponized. Every brothel had taught her about masculine weakness. Every performance had shown her how to manipulate desire. Every humiliation had revealed the hollow core of imperial power. When Theodora returned to Constantinople 5 years later, she was no longer the broken circus girl who had fled. She was a woman with a mission, armed with intelligence, beauty, and an absolute understanding of human nature. She established herself as a courtesan of the highest class. But this was no mere return to prostitution. This was strategic positioning. Her clients weren't sailors and merchants now. They were senators, generals, and palace officials. Each encounter gathered intelligence. Each whispered secret became ammunition. But Theodora had her sights set on the ultimate prize. In the palace lived Justinian, nephew of Emperor Justin I, and heir apparent to the Byzantine throne. He was brilliant, but inexperienced with women, devoted to legal reform, but naive about political realities. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man Theodora could mold into her perfect partner. Their first meeting was orchestrated with surgical precision. Theodora knew that Justinian frequented certain intellectual circles, where theological debates raged late into the night. She positioned herself at these gatherings, initially as a silent observer, then gradually as a contributor whose insights on Christian doctrine left the future emperor stunned. Here was a woman who could match his intelligence, share his religious passion, and offer perspectives he had never considered. What Justinian didn't realize was that every word from Theodora's lips was calculated, every theological insight designed to fascinate him, every gesture crafted to bind him to her will. August 1st, 527 CE, in the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral in Christendom, Justinian and Theodora were crowned as joint rulers of the Byzantine Empire. But this was no ordinary coronation. Theodora demanded, and received, equal status with her husband, something unprecedented in Roman history. As the patriarch placed the crown upon her head, Theodora must have remembered the jeering crowds of her childhood, the hands that had groped her on stage, the men who had paid to use her body. Now those same men knelt before her, their faces pressed to the marble floor. But power, Theodora quickly discovered, was more complex than revenge. The empire she inherited was crumbling from within. Corruption had rotted every institution. The army was unpaid and rebellious. The people groaned under crushing taxation. Worse still, religious divisions threatened to tear the empire apart. The Monophysite controversy that had once offered Zephyr comfort now presented an impossible political challenge. Orthodox Christians dominated Constantinople, while Monophysites controlled Egypt and Syria. Choose one side, and the other would revolt. Try to please both, and she would satisfy neither. But Zephyr had learned something crucial during her years in the gutter. Sometimes survival required embracing the monster others accused you of being. Within months of her coronation, Theodora began systematically eliminating her enemies. But she was too clever for crude assassination. Instead, she weaponized the very corruption she had inherited. Take the case of Senator Anastasius, one of her most vocal critics. Rather than having him killed, Theodora had her agents investigate his financial dealings. When they discovered, as she knew they would, evidence of embezzlement, she didn't expose him immediately. Instead, she summoned him to a private audience. "My dear Senator," she reportedly said, "I've discovered some irregularities in your accounts, but I'm prepared to overlook them if you can help me understand why someone of your wisdom opposes certain imperial policies." Anastasius left that meeting a broken man. He became Theodora's most vocal supporter, his every speech a testament to her mercy and wisdom. Those who didn't know the truth marveled at her ability to convert enemies into allies. Those who suspected the truth learned to fear her more than death itself. This became Theodora's signature method. She didn't just defeat her opponents, she transformed them into weapons against their own allies. Soon, Constantinople's elite lived in terror, never knowing who among them was secretly reporting to the Empress, never certain which of their secrets might be used to destroy them. While Justinian focused on his grand legal reforms and military campaigns, Theodora played a far more dangerous game with the empire's religious divisions. Publicly, she supported her husband's efforts to maintain Orthodox Christianity. Privately, she began building a shadow network of Monophysite priests and bishops. Her palace became a secret sanctuary for persecuted Monophysite clergy. In hidden chambers beneath the imperial quarters, forbidden services were conducted, while Orthodox ceremonies proceeded in the official chapels above. Theodora was literally living a double religious life, maintaining perfect orthodoxy in public while nurturing heresy in private. But this wasn't mere religious conviction, it was strategic genius. By protecting the Monophysites, Theodora was building a power base that owed everything to her personally, rather than to the imperial office. If revolution came, these religious minorities would fight for her, not for the empire. The plan's brilliance revealed itself during the first major crisis of their reign. In 532 CE, riots broke out across the eastern provinces as Monophysite populations rose against Orthodox persecution. Rather than crush the rebellions militarily, Theodora sent secret messages through her religious network. The riots ended almost overnight, replaced by prayers for the empress's health. Justinian never understood how his wife had achieved this miracle. He assumed it was divine favor rewarding their pious rule. In reality, Theodora had just demonstrated that she commanded loyalties her husband couldn't even comprehend. By January 53 CE, Constantinople was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. High taxes, religious persecution, and Theodora's increasingly authoritarian rule had pushed the population to the breaking point. The circus factions, the very blues and greens of Theodora's childhood, had evolved into something resembling political parties, each with their own armed militias. The spark came during the traditional racing season at the Hippodrome. A series of controversial verdicts by Justinian's judges had condemned several faction members to death. When the executions were botched and 2 men survived the hanging, both factions took it as a sign from God that the men should be pardoned. Justinian refused. In response, something unprecedented happened. The eternal enemies, blues and greens, united against their rulers. Their battle cry echoed through the streets. Nika! Nika! Victory! Victory! What began as a protest over executions quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. The crowd began chanting for the removal of Justinian's most hated officials, including the tax collector John the Cappadocian and the legal advisor Tribonian. But behind these demands lay a more terrifying threat. They wanted Theodora gone. For 5 days, Constantinople burned. Government buildings were destroyed, officials were murdered in the streets, and rebel militias controlled entire districts of the city. In the palace, panic waned. Justinian's generals advised immediate evacuation. Ships were prepared for a desperate flight to safety. But as her husband wavered on the edge of collapse, Theodora revealed the iron core that years of brutalization had forged within her soul. The Imperial Council meeting of January 18th, 532 CE, would become legendary. As reports of the rebellion's growing strength poured in, as flames lit the night sky beyond the palace windows, Justinian's advisors unanimously recommended immediate evacuation. The city is lost, Caesar. General Belisarius reportedly argued. We can return with a larger army when the situation stabilizes. Justinian nodded, his nerve finally broken. Orders were given to prepare the imperial fleet for immediate departure. Then Theodora rose from the throne. What happened next was recorded by the court historian Procopius, no friend of the empress. But even he couldn't deny the power of her words. I do not know if it is noble for a sovereign to flee, but for me it is impossible. Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. I will not live to see the day when I am not saluted as empress. If you wish to flee, Caesar, you have the money. The ships are ready. The sea is open. But think whether, when you reach safety, you will not gladly exchange that safety for death. As for me, I like the old saying, the imperial purple makes a fine burial shroud. The room fell silent. Here was a woman who had crawled from the gutter to the throne, and she would rather die than return to powerlessness. Her courage, or perhaps her desperation, shamed the men around her. One by one, they pledged to stay and fight. But Theodora had more than inspiring words. She had a plan that would forever stain her legacy with blood. While Justinian rallied his remaining troops, Theodora set in motion a scheme of breathtaking cunning and cruelty. She understood something her male advisors had missed. The rebels' greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. The Blues and Greens had united against the throne, but their alliance was fragile, built on temporary shared anger rather than genuine partnership. Theodora dispatched her most trusted agent, the eunuch Narcissus, to the Blue faction's leadership. The message was simple. The Empress remembered her debt to the Blues for taking in her family decades earlier. If they withdrew from the rebellion, she would ensure their grievances were addressed, and their enemies among the Greens were punished. Simultaneously, she sent gold, vast amounts of it, to key Blue commanders, not as a bribe for immediate action, but as a promise of future rewards. The money came with a warning. The Empress's memory was long, and she rewarded loyalty as surely as she punished betrayal. The psychological warfare was masterful. Theodora wasn't asking the Blues to betray their Green allies immediately. She was simply planting seeds of doubt, reminding them that their temporary alliance with their ancient enemies might not serve their long-term interests. While Narcissus worked on the Blues, Theodora prepared the second phase of her plan. She sent word to the rebel leadership that she was prepared to negotiate. As a gesture of good faith, she would meet with their representatives in the Hippodrome itself, the very site where her childhood humiliation had begun. The rebels saw this as vindication of their power. The mighty Empress, reduced to begging for terms in the arena where she had once performed degrading acts. They eagerly agreed to the meeting, never suspecting that they were walking into the most elaborate death trap in Byzantine history. January 18th, 532 CE. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Constantinople, nearly 30,000 rebels crowded into the Hippodrome. They came armed but confident, believing that Theodora's request for negotiations proved their victory was assured. The Blues and Greens sat in their traditional sections, their temporary alliance holding, despite whispered doubts. What the rebels didn't know was that Theodora had spent the previous night positioning her pieces like a master chess player. General Belisarius and his Gothic mercenaries waited in the tunnels beneath the arena, the same passages through which wild animals had once been brought to fight gladiators. These weren't Roman citizens who might hesitate to kill their countrymen, but foreign warriors who owed everything to imperial gold. Mundus, another of Justinian's generals, positioned his Illyrian troops at the Hippodrome's main exits. Again, these were provincials with no sentimental attachment to the Constantinople mob. To them, the rebels were just another enemy to be eliminated. But the masterstroke was Theodora's final message to the Blue faction leadership, delivered even as they sat in the arena. The Empress, through Narcissus, revealed that she had discovered a Green conspiracy to blame the entire rebellion on Blue instigation once the government fell. Evidence had been fabricated, witnesses prepared. If the Greens succeeded in overthrowing Justinian, they planned to execute the Blue leadership and claim all power for themselves. It was, of course, a complete fabrication, but it was a lie built on decades of genuine Blue-Green hatred, making it believable enough to shatter the rebels' fragile alliance at the crucial moment. The negotiations were a sham, designed only to get the rebel leadership into the perfect killing ground. When Theodora's representative stood to address the crowd, his words were not terms of surrender, but a signal for slaughter. "Citizens of Constantinople," he announced, "the Empress regrets that certain individuals have chosen the path of rebellion against God's anointed rulers. Those who repent immediately will be shown mercy. Those who persist in their treason will face divine justice." The crowd erupted in outrage, but their angry shouts were drowned by a more terrifying sound, the clash of weapons echoing from the tunnel entrances as Belisarius's Gothic warriors poured into the arena. The rebels found themselves trapped in the same oval of sand where gladiators had died for public entertainment. But now, they were the show, and the imperial soldiers were the only audience that mattered. Panic spread like wildfire through the packed stands. 30,000 people tried to flee through exits that had been deliberately sealed or were guarded by Mundus's troops. The fortunate few who reached these blocked passages were cut down immediately. The rest were trapped like animals in an abattoir. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic extermination. The Gothic warriors, fighting in organized formations, carved through the panicked mob with ruthless efficiency. The rebels had weapons but no organization, numbers but no leadership, courage but no strategy. For hours, the killing continued. The sand of the hippodrome, which had absorbed the blood of countless gladiators and wild animals, now drank deeply of citizens' blood. The screams of the dying echoed off the marble walls, while smoke from the burning city drifted overhead like a funeral shroud. The most chilling aspect of the massacre was the moment when Theodora's psychological manipulation bore its bloodiest fruit. As the slaughter reached its peak, significant portions of the blue faction suddenly turned on their green allies. The lies Narcissus had whispered found fertile ground in ancient hatreds. Blue fighters, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Greens just hours earlier, now saw enemies everywhere. In their panic and confusion, they began to believe that the Greens had indeed planned to betray them, that this massacre was somehow a Green trap rather than an imperial one. What began as unified resistance dissolved into factional chaos. Blues attacked Greens, Greens fought Blues, and both were systematically eliminated by the imperial troops, who watched this fratricidal frenzy with cold satisfaction. This was Theodora's masterpiece of manipulation. She had not only destroyed her enemies, but had made them destroy each other. The rebels died convinced that their greatest enemies were not the soldiers killing them, but their former allies fighting beside them. When the imperial box high above the carnage, Theodora watched her childhood tormentors die. Every blue who had mocked her family's desperation, every green who had applauded her degradation, every citizen who had paid to see her suffer. They were all down there in the sand, bleeding out their lives as payment for her humiliation. When the killing finally stopped, the hippodrome looked like a vision of hell. 30,000 bodies lay piled in the sand, their blood forming lakes that reflected the setting sun like crimson mirrors. The survivors, those few who had proven their loyalty by betraying their comrades, knelt in terrified silence. Theodora descended from her box to walk among the dead. This woman, who had once been dragged through this same arena as a helpless child, now strode across it as absolute ruler. Her purple robes trailed through pools of blood, but she showed no more emotion than if she were reviewing a military parade. The psychological impact of the massacre extended far beyond the immediate death toll. Every citizen of Constantinople understood that their empress was capable of anything. The woman who had ordered the killing of 30,000 rebels in a single afternoon would not hesitate to eliminate any future threat, no matter how small. But Theodora's cruelty served a calculated purpose beyond mere revenge. The Nika rebellion had been the last serious challenge to her authority. By crushing it with such spectacular brutality, she ensured that no one would dare oppose her again. The massacre was not just punishment for rebellion, it was a promise of what awaited anyone who forgot their place. In the months that followed, a strange peace settled over the empire. Crime rates plummeted, not because conditions improved, but because criminals feared that any disorder might bring imperial attention. Tax collection became remarkably efficient as citizens competed to demonstrate their loyalty. The machinery of government, lubricated with terror, ran smoother than it had in decades. The years following the Hippodrome massacre saw the Theodora reach the zenith of her power. With internal opposition crushed, she could focus on reshaping the empire according to her vision. But that vision was shaped by the brutal experiences of her early life, creating a reign that mixed remarkable progressivism with shocking cruelty. On one hand, Theodora championed causes that seemed impossibly advanced for her era. She established homes for former prostitutes, giving women like her younger self a chance at redemption without having to marry their way out of degradation. She reformed laws dealing with rape and adultery, shifting punishment from victims to perpetrators. She even managed to outlaw the exposure of unwanted infants, a common practice that had condemned countless children to fates like her own. These reforms weren't mere charity. They were strategic moves by a ruler who understood that social stability required protecting the vulnerable. A woman who remembered being powerless, never forgot that today's victims could become tomorrow's rebels if their desperation grew too great. But Theodora's compassion had limits, and those limits were defined by her perception of threat. Anyone she viewed as an enemy faced treatment that made the Hippodrome massacre look restrained. Rivals disappeared into the palace dungeons, never to be seen again. Generals who grew too popular found themselves reassigned to impossible missions in plague-ridden provinces. Even longtime allies learned that the Empress' friendship lasted only as long as their absolute loyalty. The most chilling example was her treatment of Pope Silverius in 5037 CE. When the Pope refused to support her monophysite religious policies, Theodora didn't simply have him deposed. She had him kidnapped, transported to a remote island, and starved to death while maintaining the fiction that he had voluntarily resigned his position. This became Theodora's signature method for dealing with religious opponents. Public murder would create martyrs. Mysterious disappearances created only fear. By 540 CE, Theodora had constructed the most sophisticated intelligence network in the medieval world. Her spies operated throughout the empire and beyond, gathering information that allowed her to anticipate and crush threats before they fully form. The network's genius lay in its recruitment strategy. Rather than relying solely on professional agents, Zephyro enlisted the services of people whom society typically ignored: servants, prostitutes, slaves, and religious minorities. These invisible populations had access to elite conversations and could move through society without attracting attention. Former circus performers became some of her most valuable assets. They understood the entertainment industry's connections to organized crime and political corruption. Retired prostitutes infiltrated the social circles of potential rebels, gathering intelligence during intimate moments when men's guards were completely down. Religious minorities, protected by Theodora's private patronage, provided early warning of theological disputes that could explode into political crises. The Empress also pioneered the use of economic intelligence. Her agents tracked grain shipments, monitored tax collection, and analyzed trade patterns to predict potential sources of unrest. By understanding the empire's economic vulnerabilities, she could address problems before they triggered rebellions, or exploit those same vulnerabilities to bring pressure against potential enemies. But perhaps most importantly, Theodora's network gave her something no previous ruler had possessed: accurate information about public opinion. She knew what people said in private about her policies, what rumors were spreading through the markets, and which officials were losing the confidence of their subordinates. This intelligence allowed her to maintain popular support through carefully targeted reforms, while simultaneously eliminating specific threats before they could organize effective opposition. For all her political success, Zephyro's reign exacted a terrible personal price. The constant paranoia necessary to maintain her position gradually isolated her from genuine human connection. Even her relationship with Justinian, once built on genuine affection and intellectual partnership, became increasingly transactional as both spouses maneuvered for advantage within their own marriage. The Empress never bore Justinian a surviving heir, a failure that haunted her throughout their reign. Some historians suggest this was due to damage from her early years in prostitution. Others point to the stress of constant political warfare. Whatever the cause, the lack of children meant that Theodora's power would die with her, making every political calculation a race against time. This temporal limitation drove her to increasingly desperate measures to secure her legacy. Zephyros. She began grooming potential successors among her relatives, but each candidate faced the same problem. They lacked her personal history of survival and her intimate understanding of power's darker mechanisms. How could she teach someone to rule through fear when they had never experienced helplessness themselves? The irony was profound. Theodora's greatest strength, her ability to think like both predator and prey, was precisely what made her irreplaceable. The very experiences that had qualified her to wield absolute power ensured that no one else could successfully inherit that power. As she aged, Theodora became increasingly obsessed with controlling information about her early life. Former circus colleagues, who might remember embarrassing details, found themselves facing generous retirement packages in distant provinces, or simply disappeared if they seemed unreliable. She commissioned official histories that portrayed her youth in carefully sanitized terms, creating a mythology that obscured the brutal reality of her rise to power. But memory, Theodora discovered, was harder to control than current events. The people of Constantinople might fear to speak openly about her past, but they whispered about it in private, passing down stories that would outlive any official propaganda. In 541 CE, a new enemy arrived in Constantinople, one that even Theodora's intelligence network couldn't anticipate, or her ruthlessness couldn't intimidate. The bubonic plague, later known as Justinian's plague, swept through the empire like a scythe through wheat, killing an estimated 25 million people. Essential, lovely fate of the fate. No more and no faithful will be sent for us. For the first time in her adult life, Theodora faced a crisis that couldn't be solved through manipulation, bribery, or violence. The plague killed senators and slaves with equal indifference, respected neither imperial purple nor beggar's rags. Even the empress's extensive spy network began to collapse as agents died faster than they could be replaced. But if the plague couldn't be intimidated, Theodora could still use it as a weapon against her enemies. She noticed that the disease spread faster in crowded, unsanitary conditions, exactly the kind of places where political opposition might organize. Under the guise of public health measures, she ordered the demolition of entire neighborhoods where rebel sentiment had been detected. Quarantine became a convenient excuse for eliminating inconvenient people. More chillingly, Theodora began to see the plague as divine judgment on her enemies. When officials who had opposed her died of the disease, she publicly proclaimed their deaths as proof of God's favor for her reign. When her supporters survived, she credited their loyalty with earning divine protection. This theological interpretation of the plague served to strengthen her political position, even as the empire crumbled around her. Crisis also revealed Theodora's remarkable administrative competence. While Justinian fell ill and nearly died of the plague himself, the empress took control of the empire's response. Zephyros. She organized relief efforts, maintained food supplies to prevent famine, and kept the government functioning despite the massive loss of personnel. Her success in managing the plague crisis paradoxically strengthened her reputation, even as it demonstrated the fragility of the order she had created. Citizens who had feared her tyranny now depended on her competence for survival. As the 540s progressed, Theodora's health began to fail. The constant stress of maintaining absolute power, combined with the physical toll of her brutal early life, gradually wore down even her iron constitution. But she refused to show weakness, maintaining her public facade of invincibility, even as cancer slowly consumed her body. Her final years were marked by increasingly erratic behavior, as she struggled to control a deteriorating situation. The plague had weakened the empire's military capacity, just as new enemies pressed against its borders. The economy, already strained by her massive intelligence networks and public works projects, began to buckle under the combined pressure of population loss and military expenses. Theodora's response to these mounting crises revealed both her greatest strengths and her most dangerous flaws. She continued to successfully anticipate and eliminate internal threats, but her methods had become so harsh that they were destroying the very institutions she sought to protect. Officials lived in such terror of her displeasure that they began providing only information they thought she wanted to hear, gradually blinding her to the empire's true condition. The empress also became increasingly obsessed with religious orthodoxy, perhaps seeking divine forgiveness for her lifetime of calculated cruelty. But even her religious devotion was tainted by political calculation. She supported theological positions primarily based on their utility in maintaining her power, rather than genuine spiritual conviction. In June 5th CE, Theodora finally succumbed to the cancer that had been quietly killing her for months. She died as she had lived since gaining power, surrounded by luxury but isolated from genuine human connection, feared by all but loved by none. Theodora's death marked the beginning of the end for Justinian's reign and the Byzantine Empire's golden age. Without her intelligence networks, political cunning, and ruthless efficiency, Justinian proved incapable of maintaining the order she had imposed through terror. The empire she left behind was simultaneously stronger and more fragile than the one she had inherited. Her administrative reforms had created more effective government institutions, but those institutions depended entirely on the kind of absolute authority that only someone with her unique background could wield. Her successors, lacking her intimate understanding of power's mechanics, gradually lost control of the machinery she had so carefully constructed. History's judgment of Theodora remains deeply divided. Some historians celebrate her as a pioneering feminist who rose from oppression to champion women's rights and effective governance. Others condemn her as a tyrant whose cruelty made her husband's reign synonymous with despotism. Perhaps both perspectives miss the larger truth. Theodora was neither hero nor villain, but something more complex. A product of her brutal circumstances, who used every tool at her disposal, including mass murder, to survive and thrive in a world that had tried to destroy her. The circus girl who became Empress left behind a simple but terrifying lesson. Those who have experienced absolute powerlessness will do absolutely anything to avoid experiencing it again. And her rise from trafficking victim to imperial executioner, Theodora embodied both the human capacity for transcendence and the corruption that absolute power inevitably brings. 30,000 died in the Hippodrome because a child had once been humiliated there. The empire itself ultimately fell because survival skills that worked in Constantinople's gutters proved inadequate for governing a civilization. In the end, Theodora's greatest achievement and her most damning failure were the same thing. She had successfully transformed herself from victim to victimizer, ensuring that no one would ever hurt her again, but guaranteeing that her legacy would be written in blood.